All right, let's get into this. If you remember from last time, we learned in our Mishnah, specifically, this is a Mishnah from the tractate of Shabbat, right? That the tailor cannot go out with needle um, when it's near sunset on Friday, right before evening. Right? Why? Because remember, carrying is a biblical prohibition to take an object from a reshut yachid to a reshut rabim, from a private reshut to a public reshut would be considered a biblical violation of the Torah, even something as small as the needle, like in this case, right? Lest one forgets and leaves. Um, Now, it's of course going to be a big thing, a big question of what does this mean, lest one forgets and leaves? So do they forget that it's Shabbat? Do they forget that they have the needle on themselves? We learned the Tosafot that really argued with Rashi over, what is the meaning of this exactly, and what is exactly being forgotten. Immediately, the Gemara gives an example, gives another Braitic or Tanaitic material based in a parallel tradition that they feel like obviously has something to do with this. And it's specifically the case of drinking water, right? When you're standing in a Rishut Yachid, right? And there is a water fountain of some sort in the Rishut Rabim, right? And you want to drink from it. And the question is, can you lean over from the Rishut Rabim into the Rishut Yachid and drink from the water? And the Braitic material, the Tanaic material, that's from the same period as the Mishnah, basically says that you can do it if you lean over not just your head, but also your body as well, right? So you can do that. And the idea seems to be that if you do that, there's much less of a chance you're going to take the keli, you're going to take the vessel that you're drinking the water out of back, or take the water back into your Rishut Yachid and just like reflexively just stand up. Rather, if you lean forward, there's more of a chance that you're going to leave the vessel there, and there's less of a danger. While if you just put your head in, right, the rabbis made another decree on a rabbinic prohibition from doing this, right, because there's just such a good chance that you're going to end up bringing the water back into your Rishut Yachid, therefore violating the prohibitions of the Torah. Strangely enough, at the end of this, if you remember, at the end of this Tanaitic tradition, this idea, it says, and the same is true in the wine press. And this is a very strange thing. Why is this all of a sudden talking about a wine press? 1 second, we're talking about a water fountain, and then we're talking about a wine press. What's the difference? Well, the difference is going to be a very big argument of what this means. According to Abaye, he basically says, Abaye is an Amora, and just to check our terms here, Tanaim are rabbis who lived from 0 to 200 CE, and they are the rabbis of the Mishnah, right? Very important early rabbis. And the Amoraim are the rabbis really of the Talmud, who lived from 200 to 500 CE. And so they are later rabbis. Their opinions matter, obviously, but they are lower down on the totem pole than the older rabbis, right? In the traditional idea of authority, the older rabbis from older eras have to be listened to. So Abaye, the Amora, says on this specifically that the reason the wine press is in the text specifically is because it's a Carmelite. Right now, what is a Carmelite? A Carmelite, we explained in previous classes, is an intermediary region created by the rabbis. The Torah seems to believe, according to the understanding of the rabbis, of course, that there are two domains really. There's a Rishut Yachid and a Rishut Rabim, a public domain and a private domain. The biblical prohibition is to take an object and to transition it and transfer it between one reshut and another reshut, from one domain to the other domain. That's the Torah problem. And the rabbis basically created extra domains to kind of put a fence around this. And one of those, probably the most famous domain that they created, is called a Carmelite. And a Carmelite is an in-between region, right? That doesn't necessarily have the same amount of people crossing through it every day that would make it a public domain, but yet is a very, very big space that's not fenced in, and certainly not a private domain. So we would call it a Carmelite. Examples from this would be, let's say you're in a state park, right? And you're in an uninhabited area, in either a desert, a forest, something like that, where there's not a lot of people coming through, but it's a really big open space. It's a Carmelite. Actually, most spaces today are Carmelites because we just don't have that many people as the Talmud requires to pass through a street in one day. Maybe Times Square would be a Rishut Rabim, but many people say we don't really have many Rishut Rabim, and we mostly have Carmelites. taking a possession and transferring it between a private domain and a Carmelite is considered a rabbinic violation, not a Torah violation, but a rabbinic violation in order to stop one from possibly passing into a Rishut Rabim, into a public domain, and actually doing a Torah prohibition. Make sense so far?
So basically, any carrying we do on Shabbat is probably a rabbinical violation.
Yes. Okay. Yes, which very important information, by the way, because for some, I think, who are trying to observe Shabbat, carrying is a really big problem. If you don't live inside an Eruv, it's a huge issue, right? I mean, even something as simple as pushing a baby carriage is a problem, okay? And especially when you have children, this is very not easy. And so still there's a rabbinic violation in doing so, but at least it's a lighter violation, especially if you're just getting into Judaism and you're just starting to observe and you're kind of on a path. That's a way you could say, okay, that'll come later, right? Because it's less important than if you're violating a Torah prohibition in that regard. I use that understanding all the time, and especially if it means that your children aren't going to get to shul, or you're not going to be, and you're literally driving to do a mitzvah, which is most case on Shabbat when you're going to shul. There could be a lot of grounds. It was with these grounds actually that part of these grounds that the conservative movement actually allowed driving on Shabbat. But regardless, this is we're getting a little far out. But that's a Carmelite. So yes.
Sorry, it's kind of unrelated, but the Tanaim and the Amorim. So the Tanaim, were they the last people on the Sanhedrin?
No, so the Sanhedrin, yeah, I mean the earliest Tanaim were might have been on the Sanhedrin. But the Sanhedrin quickly
70.
Yeah. So it would, there's a generation of rabbis even before the Tanaim called the rabbis of the Knesset HaGedolah, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the people of the Great Assembly, but we don't know much about those people. They were kind of like beta rabbis. But regardless, so just to get back to our sugya here, specifically about the end of our Baraitic material, our Tanaitic material says that so too is the same in the wine press. Right, so you could, and in some ways you can understand the topic being the same. Well, when you're talking about a water fountain, okay, and you might think it's different than drinking from a wine press. Now, the question is, why would it be different from drinking from a wine press? It's not like the material of the water seems to matter, especially when it comes to carrying, right? So you're carrying wine, you're carrying water. What's the big difference? What Abaye basically says, and the way he answers that question, according to his interpretation, is that it is a Carmelite. It's a representation of something that's a Carmelite. Right? And if you think about it, a wine press in a big area is a certain cutoff space where not a lot of people are walking because there's a wine press there, right? So it might have less people obviously going through it. So maybe that's why he's saying it's a Carmelite here. But the reason Abaye is saying that is because he really believes that therefore the halacha is the same as in a Carmelite, meaning let's say you're standing in a private domain, you're standing inside your house, and you're standing on the boundary of a Carmelite. Right? Not a Rishut Rabim, but a Carmelite. So therefore, transferring any object between a private domain and a Carmelite would be a rabbinic violation, not a Torah violation. Abaye says that this material, this law, this understanding of having to put your head and your whole entire body into the other region to drink of it, this rabbinic prohibition applies even when in the case of taking an object from a private domain to a Carmelite. Now, if you've been paying attention, what's the problem with that? This is kind of the big theme we keep coming back to. It's a gezerah on a gezerah. And this is the problem Rabbah has. Rabbah and Abaye are bar plukta, we say in Aramaic. They're constantly arguing with each other. They were great friends, but they were constantly arguing with each other. And basically Rabbah says, Abaye, you're making a decree on a decree. You can't do that, right? You only can make a rabbinic decree on a Torah prohibition, that something's in danger of violating a Torah prohibition. You can't make a rabbinic fence around a rabbinic fence, right? That's extending rabbinic authority too much. Obviously, Abaye doesn't believe that. Obviously, Abaye doesn't agree with that, and Abaye believes rabbinic power actually extends beyond that, so that rabbis can actually make a decree upon a decree. Okay? That's where I believe we left off our sugi. Make sense? Does anyone have any questions before we move on to new material? I know it's a little complicated, but Talmud. We have a lot of other classes that aren't as complicated. So, but Talmud is definitely a complicated thing. Any questions though? No, we're okay. Okay, let's keep moving then. Let's keep moving on to, let's see, where are we in our handout? Okay. Well, okay, we're on, and if you have the paper handout, it's on, let's see, should have put on, now I'm going to put page numbers on these things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's on the fifth page. The fifth page. And for those following along on Zoom, I'm going to share it from my screen, and on Facebook Live, I'm going to share, or YouTube, I'm going to share it on my screen. Okay, those online should see now, and we're getting to our page. Okay, so we did Rava, right? And we also understand, and so now we're going into Rava. So Rava says, and Rava understands that there's a problem here, right? So Rava believes, I'm sorry, I'm not in the right place here. On the page, this is not right. This is not right. Very confused. Okay, no, this is right. This is right. For a second, I'm sorry. I got a little confused about the hand that I made. So we're going into Rava. So remember that Abaye said that the reason for the wine press appearing in this Braidic material is to say that it's a Carmelite, this rabbinic region, and that the halacha is the same with the rabbinic region, which in a more meta way is saying, Abaye is saying that rabbis could make a decree on their own fence, a fence around the fence. Rava, on the other hand, disagrees and says you can't make a fence around the fence. So therefore, Rava can't interpret this Braita as that the reason that the wine press is in the material is because it's a Carmelite, right? He can't do that because then you're going to end up saying that what that earlier material is saying is that you can you can't you can't drink the wine or whatever it is if you don't put your whole entire body and head in it, which would be making a decree upon a decree, which is something Rava doesn't do. So what Rava then has to do is he has to interpret the meaning of the wine press differently than Abaye does. And Rava, I think, takes a more creative way of looking at this, and it really took me some time to wrap my head around what he was saying. But I think I've got it. Very interesting what he's doing. So Rava said that which we learned in the Mishnah, and the same is true in the wine press, refers to the matter of the halachot of tithes. Okay, let me explain the halachot of tithes a little bit. Some things you have to know here, right? So what is a tithe? In Hebrew, it's a maaser, or the giving of a tenth. There are many different kinds of tithes. There's a maaser rishon, a first maaser, a maaser sheni, a maaser oni, different kinds of maaser, different kinds of tithes. But in general, just the general meaning of a tithe is that you have to give 10%, right, of whatever crop you have. And usually when we just say a tithe, usually I think of it as at least probably maaser rishon, or the first maaser that was offered, which is the tithe that went to the Levites, right? So you would take 10% out, and it would go to the Levites as property. Remember that Levites didn't own land, right? So that's the way they were able to be paid for what they could do, is what we would call rabbinic taxes, right? So they pay 10%. Now, the question that the rabbis, what you have to understand implicitly to understand what Rav is saying here, is that when it comes to tithe, there is a question of when one becomes obligated to tithing, right? When in the point of of producing your crop, right? Does the crop become ready to tithe and once it becomes that it needs to be tithed, right? It is actually no longer kosher, right? Because you can't eat it until you tithe it, right? If an untithed produce would be forbidden to eat by Torah law. So the question is, at which point does the crop become liable to tithing? And basically what the rabbi said is when the crop is finished. When it is finished, it's completely packaged, it's ready to be sold in the marketplace, right? That's when it now becomes liable for tithes. So what that would then mean is technically, let's say I ate a really, I don't want to say raw, undercooked banana, right? And I just ripped it right off the tree and ate it, right? And even if those bushes weren't tithed yet, technically, according to understanding of tithing, that banana wasn't applicable to being tithed yet because it wasn't really packaged and finished and everything like that. So the rabbis basically said that if you're eating something in a temporary fashion while you're in the field, either harvesting the banana or pressing wine, which is the case in this case, right? And you just say, well, let me just take a drink of the wine while you're doing it, right? That is acceptable to do even before tithing it, okay? This is a permission to eat. Like, imagine if you were working a field, right? And you said, oh, can I have a grape off the tree? You would have to say, it doesn't really make sense to say, well, you can't have it until everything is tithed. That's just not going to work. It's going to put people into sin. So the rabbis understood this by saying there's a permission to basically eat these temporary things, right? Temporary matters, right? Have a little bit of the wine while you're standing at the wine press, or have a little banana while you're picking bananas or something like that. Okay, this is the background information you need to know, right? So this is where it comes in. So it's going to be explained, and Rav is going to explain what he means by this through Rav Sheshet, which is a prior tradition that Rav is drawing from. And he draws from Rav Sheshet, and Rav Sheshet also said that which we learned in the Mishnah, and the same is true of the wine press. So Rav actually has a source, unlike Abaye, who draws his conclusion from what we would call sfeira, right? Logic. Basically, Abaye says, well, we already talked, the Mishnah already talked about Rishut Rabim. It already talked about Rishut Yachid, the public domain and the private domain. Then the wine press must be the other domain, which is Carmelit. Okay, that's what's called logical sfeira, right? That's just Abaye is using his intuition. Rav is taking a much more far-fetched idea, which what this wine press is really about. The concern is about tithes, not about transfer of property, but about tithes, right? But the reason he's able to make that understanding and make that logical jump is because he has a prior tradition. So Rav is proving his point from having access to an older oral tradition from Rav Sheshet. So he's quoting Rav Sheshet here, who says something very similar. And Rav Sheshet also said that tradition in the Mishnah, and the same is true in the wine press, refers to the matter of tithes. As we learned in the Mishnah, one way ab initio, right? Grape juice to drink. One may ab initio drink grape juice directly on the press without tithing, right? I mean, this is what I said, right? From the outset, ab initio is fancy words from the outset, right? Not even like after the fact that you've already done it. Is it forbidden? Like, no, I'm standing at the wine. Said, can I drink this wine or not? Can I not drink this wine? You can drink this wine according to this Mishnah, right? As you're pumping it, even though it hasn't been tithed yet. Okay. And it says whether the juice was diluted with hot water or the juice was diluted with cold water, and he is exempt. Oh, nice, thank you. We have I think we have one more for you. Yeah, thank you, Josh. I appreciate it. Welcome, nice to see you. So regardless, right, the question that comes up is, right, the mission seems to be making a difference here, right, by saying specifically whether the juice was dilated with hot water or whether the juice was dilated with cold water, and he is exempt. Now, what is this deal with cold water and hot water? Does anyone know how wine was drank back in the time of the rabbis? So wine was drank very often back in the time of the rabbis because water, most of it was pretty contaminated, right? So think about, don't drink the water in Mexico or whatever it is, right? That's the way things were in most of the world. If you just drank water from a well or you just drink water from something, right, most of the time you get sick from it. So people put a little bit of alcohol into the water and then they could drink it. And so the regular way that they would drink is wine, right? That would be the normal thing that they would drink at a meal, right? And what they would do but it wouldn't be the wine that we drink, what they would call very thick wine. Like they would look at our wine and they'd say, that's like Manischewitz, right? Even the good stuff we have. It's very thick and it's very high in alcohol content. 10%, 8% alcohol, right? And so what they would do is the way they would serve wine is they would actually dilute it with water. So they'd mix the wine with water and it was kind of like grape drink, I guess, right? I don't know if it tastes very good, but regardless, and you can imagine that if you dump water into wine, you dilute it, it becomes like 1%, 2% more like beer, maybe in terms of alcohol content, and it could be a normal beverage that you would drink. And this is why always when you see with the rabbis, there's always a mixing water into the wine. Okay, so that's the case here. They're saying you're going to put some water. No one drinks wine right out of the spigot because that's, you don't do that, right? So therefore, you're either going to put cold or hot water. It seems that people either drink cold or hot, right? So if you put cold water in it, right, that doesn't ruin the entire wine, right? That's a very natural thing to put cold water in wine. According to understanding, and this, again, I'm getting this from Rashi and from other commentators, when you put hot water into the bath of wine in the wine press, it actually contaminates the entire wine. And it makes it so that it has to be drank very soon. It can't be stored after it's made. It'll get bad, which means that you've now finished the product. Because once you put hot water in it, then it needs to be drank immediately. Which means, therefore, when it's connected to tithing, you might then say, okay, well, since you put hot water in it, now it's completely finished. Now it's applicable to tithing. But in terms of when it's cold water, okay, might not be the case because I can preserve it still. Okay, so there's going to be disagreement on this, and that's what is happening here. So whether the juice was diluted with hot water or whether the juice was diluted with cold water, and he is exempt. Right? So in this, at least the way it's originally expressed, and the Mishnah says this is the statement of Rabbi Meir in particular, right? That Rabbi Meir says that whether you dump cold water or hot water into the wine that you're drinking right at the wine press, he's exempt, meaning he doesn't need to add tithes on it at that point. That is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Tzadok, obligates one to separate the tithe in both cases. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Tzadok, she disagrees with Rabbi Meir and says, actually, in all cases, once you put water in it, that means it's a product. It's finished, right? So you have to then tithe it. So you can't do that. So according to Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Tzadok, it would seem that the only way that you could drink wine from a wine press before tithing it was if you didn't put any water in it, right? Because that doesn't sort of finish the product. Now, the rabbis, on the other hand, actually take a middle position. And the rabbis, again, Rabbi Meir is one extreme position. Rabbi Elazar is another extreme position. It's a single person who's saying it. And the rest of the rabbis, the majority opinion is when the wine was diluted with hot water, he is obligated to tithe. However, when the wine was diluted with cold water, he is exempt because he returns the leftover wine to the press. Okay? Does this make sense? Okay? This is how we explained it, right? Because if it's hot water, that finishes the wine and makes it immediately liable to tithing. Well, if you put the cold water in, that might not necessarily be the case. Now, there's disagreement to this, and we really have to go into where this appears. This text originally appears in the Gemara, elsewhere, and really try to understand, what the halach is if we really cared about tithing here. But that's not really what this is all about, right? We're concerned about the Mishnah. We're concerned about carrying. Like that's the central topic we're doing right now. But let's just understand what Rava means, and because what Rava is saying is this Mishnah, this rule about putting your head and drinking it in the area is really about wine presses, right? And it's specifically about pockets. So let's draw it in. The Mishnaic material that the Gemara first quotes, which is this idea that you have to put your head and your whole body into an area, this rabbinic prohibition, you have to do this in order to drink the wine in the area, so as not to bring the vessel out of it, is for Rabbah about tithing. So how does that work? Well, if you put your whole entire head and your body into an area, into a Reshut Rabim, not into a Reshut Rabim, into the wine press, right, then chances are, right, you're going to drink the wine right by the wine press, right? And there's no chance that you're going to bring it back with you. But if you just put your head in, right, then there's a chance that you might actually bring the wine back. Now, what happens once you bring the wine away from the wine press? What happens? It becomes a finished product, right? Once you take it away, you're no longer drinking wine at the wine press. And then all of a sudden, it becomes liable to tithes, and you could fall into a biblical prohibition, right? The biblical prohibition of eating untithed goods, right? So what Rabbah is saying here, and I think this is really important, what Rabbah is saying here is that specifically the Mishnah is referring to a case here where there's a danger that you're going to violate the laws of tithes. So the rabbis are going to make a rabbinic fence around that so that you don't on mistake violate the prohibition of tithes. Now, this is a rabbinic fence around a Torah prohibition. Very different than Abaye, who's making a rabbinic prohibition around a rabbinic prohibition, right? He is doing it in the case of making sure someone might not violate transfer of good between a Carmelite and a Rishut Yachid, a Carmelite and a private domain, right, which is only a rabbinic violation. So you can see how this plays out in the logic of the way they think. I hope you see the genius here of Abaye and Rabbah and the way that they're able to read this Mishnah completely different, but in both cases it serves sort of where they are. Now we don't know who's right here, right? The Gemara doesn't, at least here, say who's right or what's the right interpretation or who are we going with necessarily. But we have these two different understandings. So what that means really is that we have to keep going. We have to keep looking into the sugya and looking in different ways to understand this question about rabbinic decrees and who's right here. Obviously, we seem to have two different parallel traditions within Judaism of the authority of rabbinic fences and decrees. We have the Abaye tradition, which is the more liberal version of rabbinic power, and we have the Rabbah version, which is the more conservative version of rabbinic power. Okay, so let's see where the Gemara goes from here.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah, this is a good time for questions.
Yeah. So the Carmelite, did it have that division of area? Did that have any basis at all in any text of Tanakh or
No?
For none? So it was just a creation of space that was public with fewer people going through it.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly. Part of the definition of a public domain is, I forgot the number, 600,000 people pass a day or something like that.
Yeah.
It's not just about how big and open the space and that everyone can access it. It's about how many people pass through it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Any other questions before we move on? Josh, any questions? No? Okay. All right. Let's keep going. So we finished Rabbah then, and we really are still left at an impasse. We really don't know who's right because both Abaye and Rabbah gave very good explanations. Of course, Abaye is Sfeira and Rabbah is based on the tradition, right? But regardless, both give pretty good explanations. So we have to really keep going to understand. Let's keep going in the Gemara. Scroll down on that sheet here. Okay. So the note here, as proof for Abaye's opinion, the Gemara states that which we learned in our mission. So the Gemara is going to try to prove Abaye's opinion, right? And so let's see how they do it. Let's see what's going on. They quote the Mishnah. And Tanan in Aramaic, it says Tanan, and when Tanan says in Aramaic, when it appears in the Talmud, it means it's quoting a Mishnah. Okay? So it is taught. Taylor may not go out with his needle adjacent to nightfall on Shabbat Eve, lest he forget that he's carrying the needle and go out with it to the public domain even after Shabbat begins. Sound familiar? What is this? What is this? Where is this located? This was the original Mishnah.
Yes.
Good, our Mishnah. This is the Mishnah that the Gemara is on. So it's re-quoting the Mishnah itself and saying, let's go back to the text itself. And he says, is it not speaking here in a case where the needle was stuck in his clothing? Okay, so what is being talked about here? What do you mean? Can we imagine a tailor? How would a tailor go out with a needle stuck in his clothing? How do you imagine? So I think
Did you say it was like an advertisement sort of thing?
Good, yeah, it's an advertisement. Good, we did it some previous year, right? We did it. They do it as an advertisement, right? The tailor would put the needle in his. I imagine they didn't wear suits back then. They wore togas or something like that, right? But they put it somewhere in their lapel, right? And then everyone could see. Oh, this is tailor. If I tailor means I can go to him.
It's like you walking around with the Torah.
Yeah, right. It's like if I had a little Torah pin or something like that. Exactly. I don't know if I'm carrying around a whole Torah. That would be a lot. Regardless, right? So he puts the thing on his clothing. So okay, regardless. So Abaye said here, or the Gemara says, in order to prove Abaye, it's really the voice of the Gemara itself. Is it not speaking here in a case where the needle is stuck in his clothing? In that case, even if he was to go. Even if he was to, this is right on the sheet. Even if he was not, I'm sorry. In that case, even if he was to go out into the public domain with the needle, he would not be liable by Torah law, since that is not the typical manner of carrying out. Carrying out an object in that manner is prohibited only by rabbinic decree. So what is it being said here? What is being said here?
Well, like if you say you had a really bad stain on your clothes that like you spilled something crusty. And Shabbat came in. Well, are you carrying the crusty spill, the substance of the crusty spill? Are you carrying that?
So that's a good thought. It's a really interesting thought you're saying. That's not where they're going.
Okay.
But it's a good question, and that's certainly a question. Like if something is attached to your shirt, is it considered carrying? Right? That's close, but not quite what they're saying. Right? It seems to be what they're saying here is that when you attach a needle onto your shirt like this, it is not the typical way of carrying. Okay? How do you normally carry it? Or any object, a small object. You can either carry it in your hand or you put it in your pocket, right? Those are the ways that any typical person carries. The typical way of carrying out is not by attaching something to your shirt, right? This would be the way we say this today is it's doing something with a shinui, right? Doing something very different, right? And then the way we normally do it. Now, according to the Torah, only the typical ways in which people carry things out are considered a Torah violation. Once you do something in a non-typical way, it is now no longer considered a violation of the Torah on Shabbat. But of course, what did the rabbis do? Made our lives tougher. Right? They said what they were obviously afraid that you were going to get around the system. Like you could basically just break any Shabbat law if you just do it in a different way. Okay? Right? So they said no. The rabbi said you can't do that either. So we're going to make it a rabbinic fence that you can't even do it the non-typical. But now that violation of Shabbat is not a Torah prohibition. It is a rabbinic prohibition. Make sense so far? I don't know if you've ever seen this, but a lot of times, and especially in the Orthodox world, if you have to do something that's technically a violation of Shabbat, but you really have to do it.
Yeah.
Right? Like for them, it's like turning on the lights. This often happens.
Yeah.
Either what they'll do is they'll use their elbow to put up the switch or their knuckle or something like that. Because why? Because that's not the typical way in which you would put on a light. Right? And so by doing that, right, now they've taken the violation from a Torah violation to a rabbinic violation. Right? So if you're going to do it, that's the better way to do it. Right? Now, it's still a violation of rabbinic law, but there are many cases where, okay, there's a great need, or there's someone who's sick, or there's someone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or the whole community needs something, you can actually abrogate rabbinic law for that reason. And so that hopefully they're doing it for that reason. And look, I think this is important in our lives, though. I think especially for conservative Jews and for us, for many of us who are just taking on observance or taking on small parts of observance or what have you, and we're kind of going step by step. If you find yourself in a position where you have to do something wrong on Shabbat for your kids or for Shalom Bayit or for what have you, using a shinui is a great way to deal with that. You guys can come in. It's okay because I'm sharing the screen. Regardless, you just might be stars on our Facebook. So, regardless. So this is a very important thing. I use this all the time in my own life because, again, being a parent of a small child, things come up all the time.
Being a rabbi, especially.
And of course, being a rabbi, I'm constantly needing to do things for the whole entire community.
Yes.
But again, if you have a particular case in your life where you're like, can I do this? Can I do it this way? Just ask me. It gets very complicated, and you should ask the rabbi for these things. But theoretically, it's interesting to know. It's important to know, right? Okay. So what the Gemara seems to be saying about this is our mission specifically then is if it's about forgetting because you have the tailor has a needle stuck in their shirt, and that's not the typical way of carrying out, which makes it a rabbinic violation, then what is the Mishnah really according to Abaye?
Only explicit carrying?
It's a case of a fence around the fence.
I see.
Right? Because even if on Shabbat itself, you stick the thing on your lapel, right? And say, I'm going to go walk out on Shabbat with this thing on my lapel. That would only be a rabbinic violation of carrying because you're not carrying out the needle in the normal way. Now, the Mishnah is saying even before Shabbat, you can't have your needle there lest you forget. And at least according to Rashi's interpretation, on Shabbat, right? And it becomes Shabbat. You forget that you have the needle on, you're going to carry. right? So then according to Abaye's what the Gemara is trying to say is the natural way, you just read the language of the Mishnah itself, it's obviously about a decree of a decree. It's about a fence around the fence.
Mhm.
Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
The logic's it's very interesting.
Can I ask one question? about
Sure.
carrying? So with carrying keys on Shabbat, I've heard that you could potentially, one way to do it without violating anything is to have the key in some type of art that you actually wear.
Yeah, I
like a
mean,
belt buckle
one way that you
or-
could do it is if you would have to make a hole in the other side of the key, but you'd have to make like a necklace or a belt or a bracelet out of the key and have one hole on the normal where the normal hole of the key is, and then you'd have to put a hole on the other side of the key because it has to be part of the necklace itself. It has to be, otherwise it's not considered. But this again, this is halacha l'maaseh. This is not exactly where we are with the Talmud here.
Sure. Yeah,
But
that's fine. Yeah.
Again,
yeah.
so again, if you have personal halacha questions, I would love to answer.
Yes, I understand. Okay.
But regardless, so this is where we are, right? So Abaye says you don't need any of this. You don't even need any of this stuff. You could just this is all cases, even in the mission itself, even in the beginning. Forget about the wine press. It's all cases of making a decree around the decree. Okay, pretty good argument. What do you think of Abaye's argument? You like it? You don't like it? Or at least the
I have
Gemara.
to think about it to understand it.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is definitely true. I've been thinking about this for a long time. So
The Mishnah, doesn't that make it like not a decree necessarily?
no, Mishnah's full of decrees, right? The wine press is in the Mishnah, right? So the Mishnah is full of decrees, right? So right, and this is we know it's a decree. It's just the argument is not whether it's a fence or not, but whether it's a fence around the fence or just a fence. Does that make sense?
Okay, so Abaye is thinking that the Mishnah itself is not just a rabbinic decree, but a rabbinic decree around a rabbinic decree.
Bingo.
Okay.
Great job. Okay, wonderful. Good. That's wonderful. Okay, so let's see how we respond. Consequently, yeah, we're at the third line from the bottom of that paragraph. Actually, if you have the paper handout, it's the fifth line. Consequently, with regard to the halachot of Carmelit, the sages issued a decree as well. And this is proof for Abaye's opinion. The Gemara rejects this, though, and says, no, the Mishnah is referring to a case where he is holding the needle in his hand, which constitutes performance of the full-fledged prohibited labor of carrying out. So the Mishnah says, so the Gemara, remember, this is the Gemara, this is a shaklavataria of the Gemara talking to itself, right? And saying, wait a second, no, why can't you just read the Mishnah and say he's holding it in his hand? And then, because that would make why you would interpret it the normal way, right? What's the problem with that, though? We're gonna obviously see a problem with that. What's the problem with that? What does the Mishnah say?
It says it's stuck in his clothing.
Yeah, the Mishnah itself says it's stuck in his clothing. So you can't hold it like that, right? So you can't do that, right? So he's making the suggestion, which to me, honestly, the Gemara is just is sort of like grasping at straws here. But I don't. It's not. This is not going to hold up. Well, let's see where the Gemara goes. Come near. Another proof from that which was taught explicitly in the Brayta. The tailor may not go out with his needle stuck in his clothing. Is it not speaking of a case where he goes out on Shabbat Eve and the sages issued a decree to prevent violation of another decree, just as Abaye said, right? So isn't this the whole entire idea, right? That it's a decree around the decree? The Gemara rejects this. No. When that was taught in the Brayta, it was only with regard to carrying out on Shabbat itself. Okay, so the Gemara is going to try another rereading of the Brayta, right? And say, because now what's really interesting, I mean, it's very much up for debate of how you understand this. There's this earlier material, this argument between Rabbah and Abaye, but this is not the argument between Rabbah and Abaye in terms of the way that Talmudic argument is organized, right? This is actually the voice, what we would call it is the Stam of the Gemara. This is the voice of the Gemara, which now critical scholars say is even later material than the argument between Rabbah and Abaye. It's later, what we would call Savarayim, who are looking back at the Talmud and trying to understand Rabbah and Abaye, right? And now why doesn't the Gemara just say, okay, Abaye is right, good proof, right? Well, you could easily say it's maybe because the voice of the Gemara or the Samarayim don't really want Abaye to be right? Because that's too extreme of rabbinic authority. They feel that there's something wrong with that. So they're really they seem to be pushing their finger on the side of Rav. Does anyone else see that here? Yeah, and so pay attention to that. Pay attention to your gut, what the Gemara is important, right? So regardless, right? So very, very important. So he says, okay, well, why not on Shabbat? No. Same thing's going to come out. Wasn't it taught explicitly in a Braita? The tailor may not go out with his needle stuck in his clothing on Shabbat Eve at nightfall. Samuch, the words in Hebrew is samuch lechoshe, right? Near darkness, meaning it's not actually Shabbat yet. It says Erev Shabbat.
Okay.
Right? So again, similar logic, right? The language of the Mishnah specifically says it's Erev Shabbat. Okay, so that's against the rules, right? And the sages agreed to prevent the violation of the decree, just as Abaye said. Okay, so the Gemara is going to try again. The Gemara rejects this. Whose opinion is cited in the Braita? It is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So the opinion of the voice, the Mishnah sort of cites this opinion anonymously. It says, we don't really know who this is by, right? Or they just kind of say there's a law. The Gemara is saying, no, this is a specific rabbi who has a specific way of thinking about this, a specific platform that he's saying this about, right? And it's specifically Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda believes, because Rabbi Yehuda said, a craftsman, are we just, sorry for those following online. We're going to just make sure that you guys can see too. Here we go. We're on Rabbi Yehuda on the third line from the bottom on the web here. So whose opinion is cited in this Braita? It's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who said, a craftsman who carries out an object in the manner common to his craft, even if others do not generally carry it out in this manner, the craftsman is liable because he carried the object out in a manner standard for him. Interesting. Okay, so what's the argument that Rabbi Yehuda's made? Did anyone get it? It felt like maybe you got it, right?
I just like it was just kind of like
it flashed in your head.
Yeah, it's like hard to kind of put in words, but yeah.
Yes.
It doesn't matter if it's pinned in a shirt because that's how he usually carries it, so it still applies.
Bingo, right? That's the way he does it. Now it's going to be interesting the way is it. I think what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that anybody who's a craftsman, anyone who's a tailor, does it like this.
Yeah.
Right. This is the way of the trade of those who are tailors to put their needle in their shirt. Which means, therefore, at least if you are a tailor, that is the typical way in which you would do that malacha. Therefore, is it a biblical prohibition or a rabbinic prohibition that he's violating?
That's so
genius, right?
Great. Oh my gosh.
It's a Torah prohibition, exactly, which means that Rabbah would then be right that it's only a prohibition offense around the Torah prohibition, which is completely conservative to do. Very interesting. Now, I just want to take a step back. This is really interesting what's being said because technically then, based on who you are and whether you want to say it's the job you do or the way you behave in your life, we can argue about that. The law changes on whether you're actually doing a prohibition on Shabbat or not, right? You could be violating a biblical prohibition or not violating a biblical prohibition based on what job you are, right? And that's how we classify what this labor looks like. It's very interesting because you would think of like either working on Shabbat or not working on Shabbat being really related to either it's work or it's not work. It's for everybody.
Subjective, like different rules for everyone.
Exactly.
This person could walk with a needle pinned in their shirt if they're not a tailor.
Exactly. Right now, I don't want to say they can. Right? It's still a poor avalosaurus. We say it's
either lashes or death.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So regardless, right. But I think this is a very interesting idea that just in terms of taking a step back, work on Shabbat can be considered work is dependent on our status, depending on what we do with it and the way we relate to that work. If what you're doing is the normal work you do and the way you do things the rest of the week, then it would be considered a violation. Right? It would be considered a biblical prohibition. But if that's not what you do normally during the week, right? And that's not the way you normally do things, it wouldn't be considered work. Right? This really came up in time about riding bicycles in Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you're inside an A roof. Can you ride a bicycle on Shabbat? Well, there are some authorities who say yes. There's some authorities who say yes, right? And because you're not really carrying anything, as long as the bike doesn't break or whatever, okay.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the arguments we use is it's not Shabbos thing, right? It's not. It's what they would call udin dechol, right? It's stuff you do during the week, right? Because you use your bike as transportation during the week to get places, and it will remind you of being in the week, right? And therefore you can't do it, right? So some rabbis say that, but maybe you just ride your bike on Shabbat, right? Maybe that's a Shabbat thing you do, right? And you ride your bike for fun, not for transportation, but for fun. So when you get on your bike, it's not the law really does change based on the way you relate to that labor. So I just think that's a really big lesson for us in Shabbat of like when we construct our own lives of like, am I going to do this? Am I not going to do this? One of the ways to think about it, besides just the pure halacha of it, of like, okay, is this a biblical permission? Is this whatever? Is to say, is this the thing that I do all the time during the week? And maybe I shouldn't be doing it if I'm doing it during the week, right? For example, you know, I in particular, at this point in my life, use electric on Shabbat. Most conservative rabbis do, because we don't believe it's fire. But I use electric to turn on the light, right? But what I don't do is turn on my iPad. Why? Right? Because that would immediately remind me of the week, right? That's weekday stuff that I do, right? Then I'm all of a sudden working. I use my iPad for work. I'm getting into the weekday mindset, right? So I think it's important to pause here for you to understand, like, how do we thoughtfully do this? Oh, what happened here? We're still on. Okay, good. For some reason my screen stopped sharing. I'm sorry, everybody online. Just give me a second. Okay, we're back. All right. Regardless, so I just wanted to stop for a second and do that. So what we'll do is we'll pick this up next week because I don't think we can get to the end of this last paragraph before we finish. We'll start up there next week, next Thursday at 10. Please remember to review. I would really suggest, like, even if you're in person here, like if you want to review before next class, you can listen to the podcast. You can listen to YouTube. It's a great while you're driving somewhere, just to get the arguments in your head. With Gemara and with Talmud, the most important thing is to review. Right? It makes a huge difference in your learning and the way you're able to understand and absorb what you're learning. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Any last questions before we end for the day? No last questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for learning with me today. I really appreciate everybody. We have another class today at 3:00 on the Bereshit. We're going through the Tanakh, one pasuk, one verse at a time. It's going to be, we're still in the first verse of Tanakh. It's going to be really wonderful. If you want us at 3:00 for our next class, we also, of course, have Shabbat coming up, and we have a Midrash class coming up at 10 a.m. on Sunday as well. All right. Thank you, everybody.